Let me paint you the real picture of what a Crusader siege actually looked like, because the moment you understand the reality, you'll realize just how catastrophically unprepared you are for this world. These weren't quick military operations. They were prolonged exercises in human suffering that created the perfect conditions for mass death on a scale that would make modern epidemiologists weep. The Siege of Acre from 1189 to 1191 represents everything terrifying about Crusader warfare. This wasn't some weeks-long affair you see in movies. This was nearly 2 full years of hell on earth, where both Christian and Muslim forces were trapped in a deadly embrace that neither could escape. The attacking Crusaders couldn't fully capture the coastal city, and Saladin's forces couldn't completely relieve it. Both sides received supplies by sea, creating a bizarre stalemate where armies slowly destroyed each other through sheer attrition. But here's what makes this truly horrifying for anyone who thinks they could survive such an ordeal. The death toll wasn't from glorious combat. It was from the systematic breakdown of everything that keeps human beings alive. By the end of the siege, over 100,000 Christians had died. That's not a typo. 100,000 people, and the vast majority never saw a single moment of actual sword-to-sword combat. The winter of 1190 to 1191 alone decimated the crusading armies. Disease swept through the camps with such ferocity that even the leadership couldn't escape. Theobald of Blois, Stephen of Sancerre, and Frederick of Swabia, all major nobles with access to the best medieval medicine available, died within days of each other in January 1191. If the wealthy and powerful couldn't survive with their resources and medical care, what chance would you have? The conditions these people endured would break your mind before they broke your body. Contemporary chroniclers describe scenes that sound like something from a horror movie. When horses died, crowds would gather around the carcass, and a dead horse would sell for more than it had ever been worth alive. People fought over the entrails. The entrails of dead horses became luxury food items. But it gets worse. Much worse. A single silver penny, which represented substantial money in medieval times, could buy you exactly 1 egg or a handful of beans. A sack of corn cost 100 pieces of gold, which was more wealth than most people would see in their entire lives. Common soldiers were reduced to eating grass and chewing on bare bones, desperately trying to extract any nutrition from whatever they could find. The dead became construction materials. So many people died that bodies were literally carted to Acre's moat to help fill it in. Think about that for a moment. The siege lasted so long and killed so many people that corpses became a strategic resource for siege engineering. You weren't just fighting an enemy army. You were surrounded by the rotting remains of thousands of your fellow soldiers, slowly decomposing in the Mediterranean heat. The diseases that ravaged these camps were unlike anything you've experienced in the modern world. Dysentery, caused by parasites that modern research has identified as Entamoeba histolytica and Giardia duodenalis, turned strong warriors into emaciated shadows. This wasn't just mild stomach upset. This was a disease that caused uncontrollable bloody diarrhea, severe dehydration, and agonizing death over the course of weeks. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, killed 1/6 of the French army during the Fifth Crusade. This disease literally makes your body fall apart. Your teeth fall out, old wounds reopen, your joints swell with agony, and you develop massive bruises across your entire body. It took St. Louis, the King of France himself, during the Seventh Crusade. If it could kill a king with access to the best food available, it would destroy you within months. Archaeological evidence from Crusader sites reveals conditions that would make modern health inspectors flee in terror. Excavations of the Hospital of St. John in Acre show that even the wealthy Crusaders were infested with roundworms, whipworms, and fish tapeworms. These weren't isolated cases. This was the standard condition of life during these sieges. But perhaps most terrifying of all is the psychological reality of siege warfare. Modern research into Crusader mortality rates suggests that about 19% of even the wealthiest participants died from malnutrition and infectious disease. These weren't peasants with no resources. These were nobles, knights, and clergy with access to the best medieval medicine and nutrition available. The sanitation systems that kept these armies barely functional were primitive beyond your worst nightmares. Castle latrines, the most advanced waste management systems of the medieval world, consisted of holes in walls that dropped excrement directly into moats or down the sides of castle walls. During the famous siege of Château Gaillard in 1203, French forces actually captured part of the castle by climbing up through a toilet chute. The waste management system became a military vulnerability. During prolonged sieges, normal hygiene practices became completely impossible. Moats, which were supposed to provide defensive advantages, turned into stagnant cesspools filled with human waste, dead bodies, and contaminated water. The medieval understanding of disease transmission was fundamentally wrong. They had no idea that poor sanitation caused illness, which meant they had no effective strategies for preventing the epidemics that inevitably swept through siege camps. The reality is becoming clear. You wouldn't die in glorious combat. You wouldn't fall heroically defending the walls or charging into battle. You would slowly waste away from diseases that modern medicine eliminated decades ago, surrounded by the rotting corpses of thousands of other people who thought they were ready for medieval warfare. And we haven't even talked about the weapons yet. The weapons designed for siege warfare weren't the elegant swords and lances you've romanticized from movies. They were instruments of mass destruction engineered specifically to break both stone and human bodies with maximum efficiency. And if the diseases didn't kill you first, these mechanical monstrosities absolutely would. Medieval siege engines represented centuries of refined engineering focused on one goal: delivering devastating force that could punch through walls, crush defenders, and spread terror across entire battlefields. The trebuchet, the king of siege weapons, could hurl 300-pound stones over 300 yards with pinpoint accuracy. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. These weren't just random rocks. They were carefully shaped projectiles designed to maximize structural damage and human casualties. Contemporary accounts describe trebuchets launching diseased animal carcasses, severed heads, and even captured prisoners over city walls. During the siege of Kaffa in 1346, attacking forces catapulted plague-infected corpses into the city, essentially conducting biological warfare that would later spread the Black Death across Europe. You think you understand medieval combat, but you've never considered facing weapons that could literally launch death itself over fortress walls. The battering ram represented pure, concentrated force applied to the weakest points of medieval fortifications. These weren't simple logs carried by a few men. They were massive, engineered devices weighing thousands of pounds, protected by wooden housing and operated by teams of specialists who had perfected the art of wall destruction. The sound alone would paralyze you with terror. Contemporary chroniclers describe the rhythmic pounding as psychological warfare that broke defenders' morale before the walls ever fell. But the most horrifying siege weapon was the siege tower, a mobile fortress that could be rolled directly against enemy walls. These towers stood up to 7 stories tall, packed with armed warriors ready to pour onto castle battlements. Imagine watching one of these mechanical nightmares approaching your position, knowing that dozens of heavily armed killers were about to literally drop on top of you from above. The psychological impact was devastating, often causing entire garrisons to surrender rather than face the slaughter that followed. Greek fire, the medieval equivalent of napalm, turned siege warfare into literal hell on earth. This petroleum-based incendiary weapon stuck to everything it touched and burned with such intensity that water couldn't extinguish it. Byzantine forces used it to devastating effect during Crusader sieges, creating walls of flame that could incinerate entire sections of attacking armies. Survivors described the screaming of men burning alive as the most horrifying sound they'd ever heard. The crossbow, while smaller than siege engines, represented precision death that could punch through the finest armor at ranges that would shock you. Medieval crossbows generated over 150 pounds of draw weight, firing bolts with enough force to penetrate chainmail and even early plate armor. Trained crossbowmen could maintain accurate fire at distances exceeding 400 yards, turning siege approaches into killing fields where death came from invisible sources. Mining operations during sieges created underground warfare that combined engineering brilliance with psychological terror. Siege engineers would tunnel beneath castle walls, then burn wooden supports to collapse entire sections of fortification. Defenders could hear the digging beneath their feet, knowing that at any moment the ground might literally disappear. Countermining led to brutal underground battles fought in complete darkness with knives and clubs in spaces barely large enough for a single person. The siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 demonstrates the terrifying effectiveness of medieval mining techniques. King John's forces tunnelled beneath the massive keep, then used the fat from 40 pigs to fuel a fire that brought down an entire corner of the structure. The defenders, trapped inside the collapsing tower, faced a choice between burning alive or surrendering to face execution. This wasn't theoretical warfare, this was systematic destruction of human beings using medieval engineering. Starvation warfare turned siege defenders into walking skeletons who would resort to cannibalism before surrender. The siege of Ma'arat al-Numan during the First Crusade ended with crusaders literally eating the bodies of Muslim defenders. Contemporary accounts describe roasting human flesh on spits and boiling adult bodies in cooking pots. This wasn't isolated madness. This was the logical endpoint of prolonged siege warfare, where normal human behavior completely collapsed. The defensive weapons weren't any less terrifying. Murder holes allowed defenders to pour boiling oil, molten lead, and quicklime onto attacking forces trapped in narrow passages. Imagine being caught beneath a castle gatehouse while defenders systematically poured substances that would melt your skin and blind you permanently. The screaming from these attacks could be heard for miles, serving as psychological warfare against approaching enemies. Mangonels and ballistas on castle walls turned defensive positions into artillery platforms capable of precise counter-battery fire. These weren't desperate last stands. They were calculated defensive strategies that could systematically destroy attacking siege engines while inflicting massive casualties on besieging forces. The siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 lasted 6 months, largely because the defenders' artillery was so effective that attackers couldn't maintain their siege positions. But perhaps most horrifying of all was the reality that medieval siege warfare created a feedback loop of escalating brutality. As siege techniques became more effective, defensive measures became more desperate. As defensive measures became more brutal, attacking forces developed even more devastating weapons and tactics. You weren't just facing individual weapons, you were caught in a military arms race that had been perfecting methods of human destruction for centuries. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming and terrifying. Battlefield excavations from major Crusader sieges reveal skeletons with evidence of multiple devastating wounds from weapons you can't even imagine. Skulls crushed by maces, bones shattered by crossbow bolts, and burn patterns consistent with Greek fire exposure. These weren't clean military deaths. They were systematic destruction of human bodies using the most advanced killing technology medieval civilization could produce. Your modern sensibilities and safety-first mentality would be psychologically destroyed long before the physical destruction began. So the next time you're feeling confident about your survival skills or think you understand medieval warfare, remember the Siege of Acre. Remember the 100,000 corpses used as construction materials. Remember St. Louis dying of scurvy despite being the most powerful man in France. Remember that even the wealthiest nobles with access to the best medieval medicine had a 1 in 5 chance of dying from disease alone. You wouldn't survive a Crusader siege because these weren't battles in any sense you understand. They were systematic exercises in human destruction that combined the worst aspects of medieval technology, disease, starvation, and psychological warfare into a perfect storm of death. The weapons would terrify you, the diseases would kill you, and the conditions would break your mind long before your body gave out. The gap between medieval siege warfare and modern civilian experience isn't just significant, it's astronomical. We've gained medicine, sanitation and safety, but we've lost something fundamental about human endurance under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The Crusaders who survived these sieges represent what humans can endure when survival depends on accepting unimaginable suffering as normal. That's not an insult to you or anyone else. It's a testament to just how extraordinarily brutal medieval siege warfare really was. These sieges were designed to break everything that makes civilization possible, and they succeeded with terrifying efficiency. Be grateful you'll never have to test your survival skills against the reality of Crusader siege warfare, because the evidence is clear you'd never make it out alive.